They told me, in a voice meant to be clinical and final, "You're too poor for this care." The words landed in the fluorescent hum like a dropped tray. For a second, the waiting room held its breath, the clock above the reception a thin, indifferent circle, and I felt the old, familiar tightening at the base of my throat that had been there the first time someone told me to go to your room. I did not shout. I did not cry. I let the sentence hang where it belonged, out in public, small and brittle, as if its power could be broken with exposure. My fingers tightened around the leather pouch in my lap. The pouch had been with me for 30 years and 3 jobs at the county recorder's office. It had the particular smell of paper and old ink and decisions made carefully. When I set it on my knees, the man behind the glass, he was younger than my daughter, leaned in as if he could read my life through my posture. His name tag said billing. He said it again, this time like a diagnosis. "You're too poor." The room's fluorescent light made him look flat, like a newspaper photo. I thought of the deed, folded and creased, tucked into that pouch. I thought of how many times I'd watched people reduce one another to labels: tenant, dependent, burden. I had watched it at the recorder's office, where a single form made a right and a wrong, where signatures created authority. Paper talked, paper made law, the deed made me owner. "Show me," he said finally, perhaps thinking I would produce insurance cards or a list of assets. He had no idea what a deed looked like, had never seen the name of a grantor or a notary stamp. I smiled in the way that people who have handled documents all their lives smile, small, knowing, not contemptuous. I opened the pouch, and the deed was there, the pages slightly yellowed at the edge, my name at the top in tidy ink, Celeste M. Everson, owner. He held my look for a long beat. Then he read the top line and read the rest more slowly, as if the letters were new. "This won't pay for a hospital visit," he said. He was right in one sense. A deed is not a hospital bill. It is not an insurance policy, nor is it a promise of a compassionate nurse. But it is a legal declaration of who gets to decide what happens to a house and whose name is on the lockboxes. It is the edged thing you can put down on a table when words have failed you. I put the deed back in the pouch and closed it with fingers that trembled a little, not from fear but from a surplus of long-kept resolve. A woman next to me shifted, a small gesture of sympathy or mere discomfort. Lena, my daughter, was not there. She had been that other woman in my living room months before, the day Derek had told me to go to my room, and I'd watched her step away from making the hard choice. I had been patient. Patience is a currency, I learned, and I had been spending it until I had no change left. When I was younger, I liked to tell the story of how I learned to read deeds. The recorder's office smelled like lemon oil on the desks and the soft rustle of paper. We were the keepers of people's intentions, who gifted a plot to a neighbor, who left an acre to a child. I learned to read handwriting that was hurried and desperate, to hear in a signature the end of a story and the start of another. People trusted me to make their word stand. I took that trust home like bread. But trust does not prevent a living room from turning into an arena. One evening, the television had been on with some talk show blaring, and Derek, my daughter's husband, decided he would decide the sound level of my life. He reached for the remote as if he were reaching for authority. "To your room, old woman," he said, like a judge handing down an order. It was not dramatic. He didn't shout so much as claim. The sound in the room snapped into a small, brittle silence. Lena looked at him, then at me. I took my keys off the hook with the small jingle I always make, like a door closing before a long trip. In my dresser drawer, under the nightgown I had not worn in a year, the deed waited, folded in the way things wait when they know they will be needed. I had left that deed at home out of a stubborn, private faith. It had been mine long before Derek moved in with his toolbox and his loud opinions. It had been mine in the days when Lena was still small enough to fall asleep on my shoulder, and I still made pies on Sundays. For years, I tolerated small indignities, a snide remark about my cooking, a laugh when I confused a phone contact, the way they rerouted bills without telling me. These are the small erosion marks of dominance, not the earthquake, but the steady drip that hollows stone. I let them happen because I loved my family and because I didn't want to make trouble. That is how many of us accept a soft reduction into lessening. When I took the deed from the drawer, the paper felt like a thing that had been keeping its shape for me. I read the name aloud as if it were a spell. Celeste M. Everson, owner. Saying it anchored me in the language I had spent a career serving. You would be surprised how much a name matters when a house is at stake. Call a thing by its legal name and you stop pretending it is a rumor. My first move was not dramatic. I called Andrew V. Sterling. You have to know people who do what you cannot. Andrew and I had a professional courtesy.
I knew his voice, round and careful, like the seal he used. I need to know what my options are, I said. He asked a few questions, which they always do. Dates, names, whether the house has a lease signed by the people living there. I told him the truth. There was no lease. My daughter and I had allowed Derek to stay. We had allowed the comfort of family to stand in for legal clarity. That was a mistake. Andrew told me the kind of things lawyers tell older clients. Study non-alarmist realities. There is a process, there is paper to be filed, there are timelines.
He did not promise victory. He promised that paper, used as intended, has force. Serve a notice, he said calmly. Freeze any cards you can. If services are in your name, you can pause them for non-payment, but you'll want to be careful about continuity of utilities if someone in the home relies on them for medical equipment. He was precise, and I listened. His associate, Roman P. Cruz, would be the one to deliver the notice. Roman has the kind of hands that are careful with envelope corners. He knocks like someone who knows how to make delivery final. If this reads like a checklist, it was. I learned to treat the problem like paperwork because that was the only language that had kept me safe in 30 years behind a recorder's desk. Documents do not have moods. They do not take offense. They are instruments. You present them, you follow the set processes, and the system reacts. People are messy. Paper is clean. Before Roman came, there were other small domestic operations. I stopped using my supplementary card that Derek had kept active. I called the bank and had it flagged as owner requested freeze. I will not pretend the voice on the line was kind, but it was efficient. I wrote down account numbers in a ledger, as if keeping a ledger were a prayer. I disconnected the cable the house had been paying for in my name, though they had been using it without telling me the password to the account. These were symbolic acts as much as practical ones. When you have spent years being asked to give, you must learn the small economies of retention. I bought a set of clothes that looked like the person I was trying to be. Wardrobe, I discovered, is not vanity, it is posture. A new blouse does nothing to the law, but it changes how you hold your head. I sat in a small salon and let someone with practiced hands take off the weight of years in a blunt cut. The mirror showed a woman who could be taken seriously. Her hair was still gray. I had no interest in pretending otherwise. I only wanted the face that presented documents to be the face that held the room. On the day Roman came, the sky was a hard blue, and the house smelled faintly of detergent and the orange peel I had been drying on the stove. Roman placed the envelope on my kitchen table with the care of someone who handles fragile things. The notice itself was not theatrical, a short paragraph of plain type, the words "Notice to quit" at the top like a small headline. I watched Derek unfold it. His face folded for a moment into a dozen small flurries of different expressions: surprise, irritation, then anger. He tried to tell me something about how he had been there a long time, how he'd improved things, as if time and sweat create property rights by themselves. Time does not make you owner, I said. It makes you a resident. Lena's expression did not harden or crack. This is what made my work harder and more tender. She loved both of us in different ways, and she had to choose a side. Doing nothing would have been the easier choice. Keep the peace, let the clock tick. But Roman's presence made it real. The envelope on the table was a physical punctuation. People will tolerate a rumor. They cannot ignore a sealed document. There is a law of attention that favors visible things. When Derek threatened legal action, his voice rose in a way that made the hair at the back of my neck stand up, the same way a gust of wind straightens a flag. I listened, and then I asked him a question I had asked many times over the years in the registrar's office when someone tried to claim ownership without proof. Where is the lease? Where is the signed agreement? He did not have the papers. He never had the papers. He had instead a running tally of expenses he insisted he had made, receipts smeared and folded, a habit of expecting gratitude to turn into property. I told him, as lawyers always put it gently, that the path forward would be through the system. If he wished to make a counterclaim, the process would allow it. That evening, the house was quieter. I sat in the green velvet armchair that had belonged to my mother, the one with the small tear on the left arm, and I felt like a woman realigning her bones. The armchair had a particular give to it. It was comfort shaped by history. I opened the deed again and smoothed the edges. There were signatures I had watched be made, margins I had inlaid with my caretaker's knowledge. Ownership, I thought, has a texture. It is not purely paper. It is the set of tiny acknowledgments a community makes when it says a house belongs to someone. Sometimes those acknowledgments are loud and formal. Sometimes they are quiet and legal.
After Roman left, I found myself doing the small, ridiculous things that people do when they are trying to prove to themselves they remain in control. I labeled the kitchen drawer with tape and a Sharpie. I wrote down emergency numbers in a neat hand and taped them to the inside of the medicine cabinet. I made sure all the keys hung together with their jingle like a chorus. Each small act was a stitch in a garment I was mending. And yet there was the hospital, like a scar across the front of the whole thing. The man who had said, "You're too poor for this care," was not the one who would decide who stayed in my house, but his words made visible what had been private. They revealed how little I was entitled to in public. They made me see, sharply and coldly, that dignity is contested in both sterile halls and the worn living room. The hospital and my house spoke two sides of the same story, one public, one private, both asking who belonged, who paid, who decided. A week after the notice, I found myself back in the hospital. This time I went prepared in ways you cannot keep out of a handbag, not because I wanted to fight, but because I had become allergic to the idea of being reduced without cause. The reception area smelled of antiseptic and lemon disinfectant.
The same man was behind the desk. He recognized me. Perhaps he remembered my pouch, or perhaps he remembered my face. People are good at remembering the properties of those who own things. He started to reach for his standard script, the one he used to make people small. The insurance check, the billing question, the look that says, "You cannot expect." "You again," he said, with the sort of tight cordiality that sounded suspiciously official. The waiting room hummed with the low noise of a television in the corner and the shuffling of pages from a magazine. I sat as if I were prepared for a performance. I did not bring the deed to the counter that day. I felt no need to brandish it in a clinic. But I did have with me the small, purposeful calm of a person who had put her house in order. When he made a move to afford me the same diminutive script, I interrupted with a sentence I had practiced in the mirror between ironing shirts and paying phone bills. "Words matter," I said. "So do documents." He blinked. People who treat others as less assume the conversation will not be interrupted. I had learned through the quiet labor of reclaiming my life that interruptions are a form of assertion. He smiled a practiced smile. "I'm not saying—" "You said you're too poor for this care," I said. I said the words like setting a stone in a place. Saying it did not undo the sting, but it put it on a ledger. Words have consequences. They also tell us what else needs correcting. He made a small shift in his chair and shuffled my paperwork. "We need to see proof of insurance or payment," he said. That would have been the end of it for many people. A missing card, a bureaucratic hurdle, a tired old woman turned away. For me, it was a rehearsal. "I will not be dismissed because of a word," I said. "I have been managing my affairs for decades. I will settle the financial side that is mine to settle, but I won't be told I am not entitled to care with that tone." He was about to say something that would return to the ledger of diminishment when a nurse walked past with an IV pole and caught my eye. She wore a badge with her first name, and in the way nurses sometimes do, she gave me a look that recognized the weight of someone's day. "What will you do?" she asked quietly when the man turned to consult a supervisor. "I will not let a single sentence write my obituary," I said. "I will make sure the financials are in order, and I will make sure the people who speak to me understand that dignity is not attached to a balance statement." It is a peculiar thing to say dignity is not attached to a balance statement in a place that measures care in codes and authorizations. But the nurse nodded. She has seen more than one person reduced because someone made a cheap, thoughtless remark. She also knew how the world looks when somebody takes a small stand. I walked out of the hospital that afternoon with a folder of billing documents and a small list of numbers to call. I had not shown the deed to the man behind the counter yet, though the title of this story requires that I do. The deed was a reserve, not a weapon. There are moments when you pull the thing that changes the game, and moments when you keep it closely folded. That day I kept it folded and returned to the house where a notice still lay on the kitchen table, slightly askew, like a seedling. In the days that followed, there were more phone calls, more appointments, and more small acts of housekeeping that felt like the stitching of a new garment. I learned how to be insistent without being mean. I learned that authority does not always need to be loudly asserted. Sometimes it needs only to be clear and correct. When I called the utility company and asked them to confirm the account was in my name, I was not sending an ultimatum. I was asking for alignment between the facts and the bills that had crossed the living room. Through it all, Lena moved in slow circles between the positions of protectiveness for Derek and the dawning understanding of the incongruence she was living inside. She would come to my armchair and touch the fringe of the blanket draped over it, as if checking that it was real. "Mom," she would say, "I didn't know it would come to this." She had not known.
Who among us does know when the slow erosion will harden into a line? One afternoon, when autumn had softened into a rain that made the gutters sing, Roman came by to show me a set of documents he had prepared: formal notices, a packet for any countersuit Derek might file, a basic inventory form to record items if the situation escalated. He placed each paper on my dining table like a small, deliberate offering. "This is not personal for me," he said, sliding a folder across. "It is your property and your process." When I looked at the folder, there was a neat stack of forms and a checklist. There was no triumph written into the paper. It simply said, steps completed, signatures, dates. It had the exact calm language that bureaucracy uses to turn intention into consequence. "I don't want to fight," I told him. "I want an end to ambiguity." He understood. Good associates do not cast moral judgments. They measure the terrain and mark where the road exists. Roman was careful. He knew which envelopes needed proof of delivery and which notices needed to be posted in public places. "Expect pushback," Andrew had told me earlier when we spoke on the phone. "People lose privileges when roles change. That is human. The system is designed for process, not drama. Let the system do its work." "Will it work?" I had asked. He replied in the quiet tone lawyers use when they want to offer comfort without promising the sun. "It will do what you ask it to do. I will do what I am paid to do. The outcomes vary, but clarity often forces a choice."
That is an important sentence to me. Clarity forces a choice. Many of the arguments and quiet aggressions I had lived with were choices deferred. People prefer ambiguity because it is easy to maneuver within. Paper brings the decision into light. There were nights when the house felt like a body with strange aches. I listened to the pipes and to the refrigerator and to the TV in the other room. Once, late, Derek came into the kitchen and tried to make himself important with a new menu plan, as if cooking could be the way he declared responsibility. I made tea and did not comment. Some assertions need to be allowed to wear themselves out. He would storm 1 or 2 evenings and then find small ways to be present the next, as if nothing had happened. These small comedies of behavior, indignity followed by contrition, are part of the weave of domestic life. You cannot unweave them without pulling the whole cloth. Yet there were the hospital words, always under the skin. I would sometimes wake and see them like a quick shadow. They had made my public life sharper, made me keen to avoid being a woman whose access depended on another's mood. The deed sat in my bedside drawer for a week after Roman delivered the notice. I would take it out at odd moments, hold it in my hands when the rain tapped on the window, run my thumb along the edge of the signature. My mother used to say that things have dignity and that you must treat them as such. I had transferred that sense to paper and lived now by its discipline. A few days later, the hospital called to ask about a billing authorization. They had checked with my insurer and needed a clarification about copays and out-of-network charges. The man on the phone used the phrase means test and the way people use jargon to make distance. I hung up and decided that the next time I found myself back in that fluorescent room, I would not be alone. When you are the sort of person who has spent a life working with documents, you come to understand the small rituals that give them power: a signature on the bottom right corner, a seal, the presence of a witness, a verified envelope. You learn which gestures make the clerk lean forward and which make them look away. So I arranged for someone to meet me at the hospital, not a bodyguard or a protester, a witness, a friend, and a person who had sat in rooms of decision with me. Zoe would come. Betty had offered to bring the kettle. Olga had said she would drop by after work to sit in the waiting room. I did not want an audience to gloat. I wanted companions to make the field of the encounter broader than a solitary confrontation. That way, when words like too poor were spoken, they would not be able to land where only my dignity lived. On the day we returned, I had the pouch with me, but still had not decided whether to unfold the deed and show it over the counter. The man at billing was there again. He recognized me with that slight recognition people give to regulars. Zoe and Betty sat a discreet distance away, knitting small rituals of normalcy. When the man reached for the script, I saw in his hand the little cards and forms he does not associate with human lives. He was practicing a contained authority. He started, the same as before. "We need to," I said calmly. "You told me last time I was too poor for this care." There was a micro incline of embarrassment, a tiny register in the human voice when one realizes a social misstep. He looked at me through the glass and then at his computer. "I apologize if that was said," he said, putting slippery words over the jaggedness. "Apologies matter. Sometimes they make the crack whole again, but sometimes apology is a bandage you do not want." After the apology, I could have left and filed nothing. That is the natural pattern. Accept the small restitution and let the larger question sleep.
but I had learned to expect the quiet persistence of erosion. I needed to make sure that future dismissals could not be written off as a slip. I unfolded the deed at the counter. He read it slowly, and when his eyes hit my name, his face did not harden in the way of a man who had been instructed in belittling. Instead, he glanced down at the keys in my hand and then back at the document, as if measuring the weight of both. The deed did not buy me immediate respect, but it arranged the conversation on a different table. "That is your property," he said, a fact sucked out of the paper with a mechanical neutrality. "It is," I said, "and as the owner, I have to make sure my affairs are in order." He marked a few things on his screen, and the tone of the transaction shifted into an administrative space, a place I understand. This is the thing about documents. They convert social scuffles into administrative items that can be logged, reviewed, and responded to. The indignity did not evaporate, but it was no longer a free-floating weapon. It had been pinned. When I left the hospital that day, Zoe squeezed my hand. "You handled that," she said. Her words were not a victory banner. They were a neighborly acknowledgement. In the car, I felt the residue of the confrontation like an aftertaste. I had not won anything spectacular. I had not changed a heart, but I had refused to be made invisible in a public place where strangers make small standard assessments about who merits attention. At home, the envelope still lay, and Lena and I were scheduled to talk. She sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea and the kind of tiredness that comes from shifting loyalties. "I don't want to choose," as if the only option she perceived was the wrong one. "You do not always choose between people," I said. "Sometimes you choose facts. Facts are a kind of mercy because facts are stubborn. They force the hand if you let them. You can love someone and still insist a boundary be met." That is one of the hardest lessons we ask people to learn, that love does not mean dissolving yourself. When the conversation opened, it did so with slow, quiet exhalations. Lena listened to me as I explained the papers and the intended outcomes. She heard me tell Roman that my aim was clarity, not retribution. She saw finally that the notices were not about throwing Derek out in a vindictive way, but about clarifying terms. She sat back and thought about the years of compromise that had become a new kind of cost. "I don't want to pack," she said. "Not yet." No one wants to start a domestic surgery. There is something surgical about asking someone to leave a house that has been their living room and their argument zone. But at the same time, leaving in response to a notice is a choice you can make. That is something I had not offered before. I had allowed ambiguity to be a shelter for behaviors I did not want in my house. The deed had made the conversation possible. It had moved matters from tone into tools. It had forced the family to speak in the language of acknowledgement rather than assumption. And yet, even in the quiet after the notice was served, in the small domestic rhythms of tea and dishwashing and walking past the green armchair, there was another feeling. The hospital's fluorescent line had not gone away. Its words lived like a bruise. I thought about how often public dismissal colors private behavior, and how many people never gather the courage to translate the pain into paperwork. Paperwork can be blunt. It is not warm, but it is effective. So I began a second project. If the deed had woken me up to the power of clarity, then perhaps others needed to wake up too. I made a small list, the sort of practical list my mother used to make before she left town. Wills, account passwords, where to find the deed, emergency numbers, and a short script for what to say if someone tried to make you small. I wrote the script in plain language, the way I had taught people to sign and witness over the years. This is not because I am a crusader. It is because I have watched the slow shrinking that happens when things are not named. The first morning I pinned that list on my refrigerator, I felt like I had given the house a new spine. The list wasn't revolutionary. It was domestic sense given shape. It would not by itself remove the hospital's sting, but if enough people started to carry a version of it, then a common language would emerge for dignity. A week later, Roman sent a short email confirming that the notices had been served and that we would wait the statutory period. We had not yet reached the point of locks and moving trucks. The path ahead was an administrative landscape I would walk slowly. I had the deed, I had the paper, I had the small, again and again, practice of calling things by their names. And yet I knew this truth as plainly as the ink on the deed. Paper does not make the heart change.
It only forces choices into daylight. The deeper work, the mending of relationships, the sorting of loyalties, would take time and care. But the days of being told I was too poor in a place where strangers decide worth had begun to sharpen into a campaign of clarity. There were small pleasures then, not of triumph, but of reclamation. I painted a swatch of peach on an inside wall because the green velvet chair needed a warm company. I locked a drawer and put the remaining small documents in a jewelry box with the same careful intention women save for small things. I invited Betty and Zoe over for tea and for the slightly embarrassing domestic intimacy of dishcloths and gossip. They laughed in the kitchen, and for the first time in months, I felt the sound of a house that would sleep with the windows open for the summer. The story at the hospital had not ended. It had changed its shape. Paper had become a means of speaking back. The deed, the notice, Roman's envelope, they were not theatrical devices, but practical notes in a ledger that insisted on being correct. I had shown the world, quietly, that words like too poor would not be the last word written on my life. The next move, I knew, would require me to lay the deed flat on a table where a man could glance at it and a lawyer could mark a copy, where a bank could confirm account ownership, where Lena might finally say, with a steadier voice, "I understand now." That day was coming. The waiting room's fluorescent light had been the opening chord. What followed would be a sequence of papers and conversations, and perhaps a small ceremony of repainting and returning to the armchair. But life, I had learned, does not end at a single sentence. It is a series of choices, and as I put the deed back in my pouch that night, the jingle of the keys felt at last like a call to the work ahead. If you want more real stories of people who quietly take back what is theirs, subscribe. There are lessons here that belong in more kitchens than legal offices. The envelope Roman left on my table became a kind of calendar. Each stamped date was a small drumbeat: served, received, acknowledged. People think that paperwork is cold, but there is a warmth to the rhythm of process. It promises that something will happen if you allow the system to do its slow, neutral work. The days after the notice were not dramatic, but they were full. There were phone calls from electricians who wanted to know whose name to put on an invoice, a text from Andrew that read, "Prepare to be firm, not furious," and a note from Lena with a single line, "Let's talk tonight." When the statutory period wound down and no lease appeared and no signed agreement materialized, we moved to the next step. I cannot pretend there wasn't a moment of dread the morning Roman knocked with the small crew. I have always disliked the idea of strangers handling personal things, yet Roman's manner was precisely what I needed: efficient, humane, and meticulous. He read the inventory with the kind of voice you use when listing items in a will: steady, precise, careful not to assign feeling where only facts belong. Lena helped in a way that felt awkward and right at once. She had on a sweater that smelled faintly of their detergent, and she moved between protecting Derek's dignity and being loyal to the truth. Derek packed with a flurry and a calm that looked like a script he had only recently learned. There were boxes labeled with Sharpies: kitchen, dishes, books, economy, garage, tools. It seemed to me that Derek tried to put his life into practical compartments, as if that could inoculate him from being wrong about the premise of his stay. He argued, of course. He said the sort of things people say when the scaffolding of assumed privilege is dismantled. "I've always been here. I've paid for things. I fixed the front steps." Some of those things were real. Fixing a step is a service. It is not a title. I did not make a speech in the doorway. I had no taste for theatrics. I asked him only one question that afternoon, with the quiet I reserve for reading a fine document aloud. "Where is the signed agreement that names you as a tenant?" He looked at me as if the question hurt him, which is to say, he looked entitled to my discomfort. Lena's face shifted then. She was tired, something bone deep that softens features, and I could see the slow pivot that conversation had been making in her mind for weeks. She put her hand near Derek's arm and then withdrew it. "This is not what I wanted," she said, and there was no irony in the line. She meant it. I could have insisted on an immediate lock change. I could have called law enforcement to escort someone from a house, though the law provides such options in prescribed ways. Instead, the day passed with measured dignity. Inventory recorded, boxes loaded into a truck, Roman ticking things off, and Lena watching Derek close the trunk like a man carrying more than boxes, perhaps a version of himself he had expected to keep. I watched until the truck rounded the corner. Then I stood in the doorway and felt my throat loosen in a way that was not sadness so much as relief. The ambiguity had been excised. There is a peculiar modesty to reclaiming a household. It is not a victory shouted from rooftops. It is small and domestic and filled with commutes back from hardware stores for paint, and a trip to the locksmith to change the locks to keys that fit only the locks now in my name. Roman came back to witness the changeover, and he made sure the inventory list had been initialed. "We document everything," he said, almost as if to a student. "You might not need half of this later, but it is good to have the record." The first things I did were small. I verified which accounts were in my name, requested statements for the past year,
and took the time to itemize what had been paid and how. The bank clerk, another person in a blue badge who did not know my story, handed me a folder and said, "We have you noted as owner." Those words, echoing the deed, felt like a quiet chorus. Cleaning the house after people leave is a peculiar intimacy. You enter rooms and find the seams of a life, an old coffee cup, a note on the refrigerator, a hairline in a wall where a picture once hung. I scrubbed the counters with a domestic intensity that felt like prayer. I scraped a gum from under the dining table and found the memory of a child's crayon mark along the baseboard where Lena had once stood on a stool. I did not throw everything away. Some things demanded tenderness. A toolbox with a faint smear of blue paint went back to the garage. A stack of receipts, fevered and folded, went into a folder to be examined later. Peach paint came in a small can that I opened like a gift. The first brushstroke changed the room as if it had been waiting for permission to breathe. Peach is not loud. It is a neighborly color that asks the eye to rest. It made the green armchair glow in a companionable way, and when I sat down after the furniture was arranged and the locks changed, the armchair felt like a thing returned to its purpose, to hold a person well. There was a curious aftershock to the process of eviction. Derek's friends called Lena at odd hours. There were messages meant to provoke guilt, and there were oddly polite texts asking for a forwarding address. Lena handled the logistics with a weariness that showed her growth. When she asked what to do about mail forwarding, I found myself explaining the simple facts like I had once instructed a customer at the recorder's desk. Paperwork in the right hands moves the world in manageable increments. We did not celebrate. There was no party, no champagne. We made tea and sat in a quiet domestic circle. Lena apologized for waiting as long as she did to question assumptions. She cried once, a deep, singular thing that was anger and relief braided together. I did not chastise her. There is no benefit in late bitter lessons. She sat with me and told me about the small moments she had missed, Derek's jokes that eased household tension, and the slow awareness that had been forming for months, small compromises to preserve peace that cost a different kind of price. "If you had asked me last year about legality," she said, "I would have said, I trust you, and that trust was not meant to be a contract." Her words were honest and low. I nodded. Trust is a human currency. Contracts are a legal one. They do not replace each other. Once the essentials were handled, locks changed, inventory recorded, a final clean performed, I took a week to repair the small domestic rifts.
I replaced the bathroom towels with a stack of crisp white ones because there is a dignity to having fresh linens. I placed the deed in a small fireproof box and locked it with a key I keep on a chain around my neck. It is not a show. It is a habit that says to a house, we will be careful with each other here. That care extended outward. The hospital episode had not ended with a folded document or an apology. It had left something like a dent in me that made me want to do something practical, not to punish, but to teach. If the man at billing had misread me, it was because he had never seen a properly handled deed in a leather pouch. If Lena had allowed ambiguity, it was because no one had given her the language to translate affection into terms. I wanted to make the small list I had pinned to the refrigerator into a public service. The first workshop I hosted was humble. I baked a lemon loaf, steeped tea, and invited Zoe, Betty, and Olga. They arrived with umbrellas and stories, with ages ranged like a small polyrhythm of experience. Zoe had been a school secretary for 30 years. Betty had worked part-time in a bank. Olga had done housekeeping across a few neighborhoods and had seen the ways people leave things behind. They brought questions and fears and the desire to do better. I laid out the deed on my dining table like an artifact, its edges softened from years of being held. I explained, in the plain language I had always favored, what a deed indicates. The name on the paper is not an abstract thing. It is a social fact that gives you a say in who sits at your kitchen table. We went through the list I had made, where to find important papers, who holds the keys to your online accounts, a short script for when someone tries to reduce you. I reiterated what Andrew had told me. Paper creates clarity. It does not guarantee outcome, but it does force choices. The women wrote things down in cheap spiral notebooks. They asked about wills and about powers of attorney and about passwords, those peculiar modern talismans that let another person perform in your stead.
I did not give legal advice. I explained what I had done, how Roman had served a notice, how we had requested statements, and how the bank had confirmed an account under my name. I told them that every jurisdiction differs and that they should speak with someone like Andrew if they had a complicated case. They were not here for a sermon. They wanted to know where to begin. Betty's story made us all lean forward. Her nephew had been living in her garage and had begun to assume a series of small privileges: mail handled, errands run, access to funds. I always said it was family, she said, and now I'm not sure what family is allowed to mean. Her voice was raw and honest, and in that honesty, portable. It was the kind of confession that became a public lesson. We role-played. What do you say if someone tells you, you're too old to understand this? Zoe asked.
We practiced a small script. I appreciate your help. I will make sure my paper and my plans are clear. The practice was not about being unbending. It was about asserting that dignity and help can coexist without erasing a person. Later, over the lemon loaf, a woman from across the street, someone I had watched shuffle by my house, came and sat and offered to volunteer at my small clinic of paperwork literacy. Word spreads in low, reliable ways. The neighbor who had once borrowed a ladder now brought a friend who wanted to learn about emergency contacts. The woman who sold pies down the block asked if I could come and speak at her church about practical steps. Each small invitation felt like a stitch in a net that might catch someone before the slow erosion ate them. The hospital billed me for a visit a month later for a follow-up. The man at billing who had first told me I was too poor for this care contacted Lena by mistake, trying to verify a cobbled-together insurance policy that had nothing to do with us. Lena forwarded the message to me with a note. They still don't know what hit them. She meant it kindly. I did not gloat. I wrote a short letter to the patient relations department, neutral, factual, and described the encounter. I did not make sweeping accusations about intention. I told how a sentence had cut a public corner of my life and how a simple acknowledgement might prevent another person from feeling the same small humiliation. The letter was acknowledged with a form letter in return, hospital bureaucracy's polite way of saying, "We have filed your complaint." It was not a revolution. But sometimes the useful work is not in changing institutions overnight. It is in making clear that errors are noted and that dignity matters. One afternoon, as the leaves turned and the light through the kitchen window angled like a promise, I found a woman in the hospital waiting room I had visited months before, sitting with her daughter. She looked like someone who had been told to shrink. I sat a discreet distance away and watched. When the billing clerk walked up to their counter and began the same tired routine, I noticed the daughter's shoulders draw in. I did not intend to intervene, but between us all there was now a grammar for speaking back to small injustices. The daughter came to the counter with a stack of papers and a voice that quivered with having to be brave. The clerk began, "Ma'am, and the daughter said, simply, "Please don't talk to my mother like that." The clerk checked a screen, and something in the air shifted. It was almost comedic, this small humanness that paperwork invites. I caught the daughter's eye and gave her a nod, a small benediction. She smiled, stiff and grateful, and they left with clear instructions about insurance coverage. I did not speak to the clerk. I did not have to. The deed had taught me a new form of restraint, to hold my power ready, but not to brandish it when the need was not mine. There were harder moments. Derek filed a thinly worded counterclaim that demanded we produce more evidence of ownership and alleged a promise given in the heat of a family conversation. His lawyers, if one could call them that, he had insisted on a paralegal from a neighborhood firm, claimed colorable rights based on long-term occupancy. Andrew, with the calm he reserves for messier papers, advised us to gather everything: sundry receipts, tax bills, the original deed, a ledger of payments dated and signed where available. We collected bank statements and canceled supplementary cards. We pulled together the small acts of maintenance, of non-rent payment, that Derek had listed and framed them as what they were: contributions, not title. The hearing was held in a room with a small bench and a clerk who read the dockets with the same cadence as a minister. I sat there with Lena beside me, Roman across the aisle, Andrew at the head of the table. Derek came in like a man used to moving through spaces with a certain expectation. His voice, when he spoke, held a defensiveness that sounded like someone asking for his life to be believed. Andrew presented a simple set of facts. He used plain language like a surgeon uses a scalpel, precise, deliberate, minimal. He showed the deed, the bank statements that bore my name as the payer of the mortgage, and the tax statements that listed me. He showed the notice, the inventory, and Roman's affidavit showing delivery. Andrew did not gloat. He did not savor Derek's fluster. He let the documents speak in the way I had always trusted them to do. Lena testified, not angrily, not tearfully, but plainly. She described a home that had been her childhood place, a man who had become part of its texture, and a moment when clarity and love did not align.
Her testimony did not erase affection, it simply located the facts. When Derek persisted, saying he had improved the property and invested labor that should be taken into account, Andrew asked him calmly to provide receipts. Derek produced torn pieces of paper and a stack of unorganized notes. It read as what it was, the record of a man who felt entitled because of contributions without a contract. The judge's voice, never theatrical, always neutral, arrived like a long wrath. She affirmed the facts as presented. The deed named me as the owner. No lease had been tendered. The notice had been served in accordance with procedure. She did not pontificate on rightness or wrongness. She read the law as a clerk that registers what a set of documents says. Derek had the right to appeal, she said, but for now, the paper stood as law's immediate representation. There was no cheering. We left the courthouse as if we had been to a funeral with a small resolution to continue to live. Lena held my hand as we walked to the car, and at a red light she said, "I didn't know legal things had a tenderness." I smiled in the rearview mirror. She was right in an odd way.
Legal clarity can protect tenderness. It need not be a weapon that kills affection. It can be a frame that allows affection to be honest. After the hearing, the inevitable practicalities took over. We changed the mailbox registration. I met with an accountant to make sense of the last few years' statements. I met with a locksmith to ensure the new locks were installed, and a handyman to assess damages that needed repair. Little things, like a broken porch light that I had noticed months before with a sigh. Each small fix was a stitch that knitted domestic space back into order. Turning a house into a safe home is not instant. It requires small ritual. I rehung curtains that let in a certain gentleness of light. I placed a small vase on the mantel and filled it and made sure the temperature in the house felt like a companion rather than a stranger. These are not grand gestures. They matter nonetheless. A few weeks later, I hosted a second workshop and invited Lena to say a few words. She hesitated, then told the room about the cost of ambiguity. There is a difference between loving someone and letting them take a seat in your life that erases your name, she said. The room listened. Afterwards, women came with small, practical questions: how to contact a bank, whom to call when an online account needs changing, where to keep a deed so it doesn't get lost in a drawer. We did role play again and handed out copies of the very same list I had started with. People scribbled notes, made plans, and promised to call us if they needed help. One elderly man in the back, who had come because his neighbor had insisted he come and because he liked lemon cake, raised his hand and asked, with a voice cracked with the wear of age, "What if you can't get to a lawyer?" I told him what Andrew had told me. Consult someone when you can. Use community resources when you cannot. Forms are dull things until someone breathes into them a meaning. He said, "Then we'll breathe together." It was the most touching line of the morning. In time, the workshop became a small, recurring thing. We met once a month in my living room, then in the church basement, then at the community center when more chairs were needed. People brought cookies and stories, sometimes triumphant, sometimes only partial. A woman named Maria came one night with a letter from a nephew asking for rent. She left with the names of a counselor and the vocabulary to say no without guilt. Olga started an evening group where we helped people fill out basic forms. Zoe organized a small directory of attorneys willing to give a first consult at low or no cost. The work spread in the quiet, neighborly way that do-goodness often does, through referrals, through the sharing of small bread. Which brings me back to the hospital, because the first insult, the man who had said, "You're too poor for this care," was never a mere anecdote.
It hung like a thread, pulling at public dignity, and it colored the work I did. I made no ill will toward the man. I only wanted to make sure his voice would be one among many, not the final sentence for another person. Over time, I found ways to intervene without drama. I would sit in waiting rooms and hand someone my list. I would pass a card across a counter with the line, "If you ever need help reading this, call me." Sometimes they accepted it. Sometimes they did not. Mostly they did. The final test came one winter afternoon when Lena called me from the hospital. Her voice was thin with worry and a kind of watchful hope. She had been attending to a neighbor and needed to confirm that the hospital would take a certain transfer. I met her there, and she walked up and down the hallway with a folder in her hand, the same way I had once done. The billing clerk, older now, with a creased badge, looked up and nodded. He had been in 2 of my workshops, Zoe told me later. He had come with questions because his mother had been in a messy home for years. He had learned, in that slow way, that dignity is not simply the absence of being spoken down to. It is the presence of being spoken to as an equal. He greeted Lena like a person. We sat in the waiting room and watched people come and go. A toddler made a small music with a paper cup and a rubber band. A man in a gray hat snored softly. Lena leaned back and said,
I never thought I'd be the one to help my mother with this. I looked at her and saw that she had changed. You always were, I said. You just needed someone to show you the script. Weeks became months. The peach wall dried and settled into its color. The green armchair was repaired with a new seam and a small stitch in its left arm where the tear had been. I bought a small radio with a dial that let me choose the volume precisely. It turned the television's old authority into something negotiated. Neighbors came to tea. Betty brought pies. Zoe and Olga came to help prepare the classroom for the next workshop. The house hummed with a domestic work that felt like the right kind of busy. There were quiet reconciliations. Lena and I sat once late at night with mugs of chamomile and a stack of old photos. We opened a tin that held trinkets from her childhood and laughed at the ridiculousness of my hairdo in 1973. We did not stitch everything back perfectly. There are always threads left over. But there was a new language between us, clarity and hospitality in equal measure. Derek's presence faded like a distant storm, where you can see the results, broken branches and puddles, but the air itself has cleared. He lives elsewhere now. Our paths cross sometimes in the neighborhood. He nods, discreet. There was no public vindication. There was a gentle, private rearrangement. My life belonged to me insofar as the right documents and the right processes were respected.
That arrangement gave me a new kind of freedom, the quiet confidence to host a workshop, to write a letter when I felt wronged, to help someone in a waiting room whose courage had failed them. At one of the workshops, a younger woman named Tasha came because she worried about her grandmother. She sat hunched with a nervous energy and asked more than once how to keep a password safe. We showed her a simple ledger method, a small notebook, kept under lock and with a trusted person listed. It was not revolutionary. It was sensible and plain, and in its plainness, generous. Tasha left with a small smile, and the next week she came back with her grandmother and a dozen questions about Social Security paperwork. We answered what we could and pointed them towards someone who could help further. One evening, as the light went thin and a chill settled in the bones of the house, Lena and I sat in the kitchen and talked about what had changed beyond the locks and the paperwork. I can see you differently now, she said. You were always the one who kept things. I just didn't understand how to keep myself. I reached out and took her hand. We keep each other, I said. It is not a complete answer, but it is a good one. The hospital line, "You're too poor for this care," still exists in my memory like a piece of flint. Sometimes it still sparks a certain resentment, and sometimes it tastes like a bad bite. Mostly, its power has been reduced by the simple mechanics of life: a deed in a pouch, a neighbor with a notebook, a lawyer who reads the law not as poetry, but as tool. Things that are rude or small in a waiting room can be turned into lessons in a dining room. Paperwork, which once seemed dry and bureaucratic, became a means of preserving human dignity. On a late spring morning, I found myself back in the green armchair with a cup of tea and a letter from a woman in the workshop thanking me for teaching her how to find her deed. She wrote that she had finally sat down with her son and told him that yes, he could help, but he could not live in her home without a signed agreement. It was a small triumph, and I folded the letter and placed it in the fireproof box next to the deed. It is a small thing to save such a note, but I like keeping evidence that human beings can learn to be kinder without becoming weaker. I am not a person who believes every wrong can be righted with a pen stroke. Paper does not heal grief, and it does not restore every lost moment. But paper can force choices into daylight, and the daylight is often enough to begin mending. When I tell this story, people ask what gave me the courage to act. The answer is neither simple nor grandiose. It is a combination of years at a recorder's desk where I learned to let ink do the talking, a stubborn habit of holding things with care, and a small private heartbreak the hospital made visible.
That heartbreak made me see that shrinking is never the right solution when the small indignities begin to map a life. If you are watching this and you feel the same bruise, a public word that echoes at home, know that clarity will ask you questions. It will not be comfortable. It will require naming, and sometimes it will require confronting. But clarity is a form of mercy. It relieves others from the need to guess how you feel, and it forces options into the open. The keys in my hand still jingle like a chorus whenever I leave the house. They sound less like a prelude to retreat and more like the beginning of a trip. The green armchair still sags in a way that remembers my mother's weight and the many hours of sleeping and reading and thinking it has held. The peach paint warms the room in a manner that feels like an invitation rather than a proclamation. I sit there now more often with guests, neighbors who come for small things and stay for a while, and we talk about practicalities in life.
We talk about dignity as if it were a recipe that requires ingredients measured carefully rather than a rash of righteousness. Before I end, a last practical note in the spirit of the work we have done. Not legal advice, but the plain record of what I did. I kept the deed close, I called an attorney to understand options, I had an associate serve the notice, and I gathered statements and receipts to present facts clearly. I froze supplementary cards that had been authorized by others and confirmed which utilities were in my name. Each action was tailored to my situation, not a universal prescription. Legal processes vary. If any of what I describe feels relevant to you, consult a trusted professional who can speak to your locality and circumstances. This story ends not with a trumpet, but with a cup of tea poured for a neighbor. Lena brought over a pie, Betty arrived with a thermos of coffee, and Zoe came with a new woman from down the street who wanted to know where to find a birth certificate. We sat around my dining table, papers laid out like a map, and we mapped a small, practical future for a few more people in our block. That, to me, is triumph enough. Thank you for listening. If this story helped you see an angle you hadn't, like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These conversations are how neighborhoods learn to hold each other.